I don't care if you're the Queen of Sheba, ma'am. When I ask for an ID, you hand it over. Now.
The order cracked through the stillness of a winter morning in Alexandria, Virginia. Its echo carried on the frosty air like a warning. Officer Dustin Hayes, 28, stood beside his patrol car, one hand hovering just close enough to his holstered weapon to make a point. 7 years on the force had given him an inflated confidence and attitude polished by routine stops in wealthy neighborhoods, where he believed he'd mastered the art of knowing who belonged and who didn't. This morning, his eyes were locked on the driver of an immaculate, vintage Mercedes S-Class. The car whispered of old money and quiet prestige, but the woman behind the wheel didn't fit his mental picture of resident. To Hayes, she was out of place. An elderly black woman in a burgundy wool sweater and knit cap, driving slowly through an affluent street 2 weeks before Christmas. His so-called instincts, a euphemism for bias he refused to acknowledge, had already reached a verdict. She was either a housekeeper in the wrong car or someone scouting for unattended packages left out for delivery. "Don't look at me like that," he barked, rapping his knuckles on the car's roof. "I saw you lurking. This isn't your neighborhood. Stop playing smart." The driver didn't flinch. Instead, she raised her head and met his glare with unnerving calm. Justice Eleanor Vance, 75, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath her cap, regarded him with a serenity that came not from submission, but from authority. Her stillness wasn't defiance, it was discipline. Decades spent interpreting the Constitution had refined her patience into an art form. But Hayes, too blinded by his own self-importance to read the difference, saw only insolence. He'd already radioed in a Code 1038 non-compliant driver, escalating a situation that had no cause. In his mind, he was doing his job. In reality, he was digging his own grave. Because the woman he was about to humiliate wasn't just anyone. She was the newly appointed U.S. Supreme Court Justice Eleanor Vance, the very author of the landmark ruling that had limited police authority to initiate arbitrary traffic stops based on instinct and gut feeling. Within minutes, Officer Hayes' arrogance would collide head-on with the very law he'd just broken and the woman who had written it. Justice Vance received the paperwork from Hayes in a detached, formal manner. She only required a single glance to confirm that the official reason for the stop listed on the ticket was driving too slowly and operating a vehicle in a suspicious manner, a violation so vague it was practically an insult to the law itself. She did not argue the point, but rather she let the silence hang heavily in the crisp winter air, making Hayes feel the weight of his unsupported accusation more than any verbal confrontation could. Vance's composure was truly remarkable, a testament to her decades on the bench where she had mastered the art of observation without reaction. She calmly took off her knit cap, revealing her neatly coiffed silver hair, and fixed her serene gaze back onto the young officer. It was a professional courtesy he didn't deserve, but one she offered anyway, as if to remind him that she was not a suspect, but a citizen fully aware of her rights. Hayes, misinterpreting her stillness as an attempt at manipulation or passive aggression, became increasingly irritable. He knew his initial stop was weak, and her legal silence only compounded his nervousness, which he immediately masked with aggression. He leaned down toward the driver's side window, his voice dropping to a low, intimidating level. He pressed her again, demanding an explanation for her presence. "I need to know your purpose of travel, ma'am. I'm telling you, this is a high-security residential area, and your vehicle is operating with clear indications of casing. Are you meeting someone? Are you doing business here?" His question, phrased to suggest guilt, clearly reflected his belief that she was unfit to move freely in that affluent neighborhood. Vance, knowing exactly where he was leading the interaction, finally broke her silence, but her response was the final blow he didn't expect. "Officer Hayes," she began, her voice steady and deliberate, "I am an American citizen, and I am lawfully operating my vehicle. My purpose of travel is not subject to police inquiry unless you can state specific probable cause, beyond what your own impressions have already dictated. Do you have probable cause, or are we done here?" Hayes was momentarily stunned. He didn't have a solid response, and her legal precision cornered him. His anger flared up, and he resorted to the suspicion he had built up around her attire and vehicle. He shifted his focus dramatically, peering into the rear passenger seat where he noticed several neatly wrapped boxes and a woven basket. "And what exactly are those suspicious packages, ma'am?" "You are refusing cooperation. For all I know, those could be stolen items or worse. I require you to open your trunk so I can inspect your suspicious Christmas packages." Vance sighed, a deep, tired sound that spoke volumes about her disappointment, not her fear. She calmly explained that the contents were homemade apple pies and warm blankets she intended to donate to the Old Town Community Center before the holiday freeze intensified. Hayes scoffed, clearly doubting the benevolence of her mission. He saw the items not as gifts, but as potential contraband concealed by a convincing, fabricated story. Seeing that the situation was escalating and knowing that her continued legal resistance would only fuel Hayes's ego, Vance quietly refused the search again, citing her Fourth Amendment rights. This refusal, though perfectly legal, was the final trigger for Hayes. He slammed his hand against the car doorframe in frustration, his jaw tight. He knew he had lost the verbal battle, so he chose to exert his physical authority, believing that compliance could only be obtained through dominance, not mutual respect. Hayes knew he had reached the limit of his legal authority without probable cause, yet his 7 years of ingrained bias and the sting of being verbally bested by the old lady refused to let him back down. He stepped back from the car, pulled out his radio, and spoke into it with strained professional urgency. His voice, meant to be intimidating, was shaky around the edges, amplified by the radio's speaker to ensure the entire street heard his escalation. Hayes spoke. "We've got a code 1038 here. Non-compliant driver, requesting backup for identification confirmation." This baseless call for backup was a tactical move of pure dominance, designed to intimidate Vance into submission rather than a genuine safety concern. He glanced at the side mirror, watching Vance. She remained perfectly still, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her expression unchanging, a silent rebuke that fueled his arrogance further. He interpreted her silence as a clear sign of guilt, believing only criminals maintain such composure under police pressure. It was precisely the kind of biased interpretation that had led him to unwarranted success in the past. Hayes took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to forcibly remove her from the vehicle once backup arrived, convinced he was moments away from exposing her deceit and validating his instincts. It was at this critical juncture that Justice Vance chose to shift the dynamic. Hayes's aggression had reached its peak, and she recognized that any further resistance would result in unnecessary escalation and potential physical harm. With the deliberate calm of someone accustomed to administering high court proceedings, she slowly reached for her small, dark leather purse. Every movement was precise and unhurried, emphasizing her control over her own body and the moment. She opened the clasp with a soft click that cut through the silence and pulled out her wallet. First, she retrieved her valid state-issued driver's license. Then, nestled securely beside it, was a second, darker card, her official federal ID. The metallic gleam of the embossed seal was unmistakable, a subtle but profound marker of authority. Vance met Hayes's eager, predatory gaze one last time. Hayes leaned in, ready to snatch the documents, expecting to find an expired license or a fake identity card, anything to justify his actions. The truth was about to be presented to him, not as a weapon, but as a final opportunity for him to apply wisdom over prejudice. But Vance did not present all the truth. With the weight of her judicial power and the wisdom of her age, she performed a final, calculated test, pushing her dignity and his arrogance to the absolute edge. She held both cards momentarily, the humble driver's license and the powerful federal ID, giving Hayes every chance to see the full scope of her identity, but then she deliberately pulled the federal card back. She kept the official identification card tucked securely in her wallet, only handing him the basic state-issued license. Hayes accepted the license with a dismissive swipe, already failing the final quiet examination. He scanned the photograph and date of birth, ignoring the rest of the wallet's contents, completely missing the federal identification card that held the key to his career and his perception of justice. But Vance did not give him the federal ID. She kept the official identification card tucked securely in her wallet, only handing him the basic state-issued license. knowing this final act of withholding the crucial evidence would solidify his prejudice and force his judgment to its inevitable, flawed conclusion. A seasoned patrolman whose jacket held the weight of 20 years on the force pulled his cruiser up a respectful distance behind Hayes's flashing lights. Reed stepped out, the squeak of his leather belt cutting through the tense quiet. He immediately sensed the air of overconfidence emanating from his younger colleague, a familiar sign that Hayes was prioritizing his ego over procedure. Reed approached Hayes and lowered his voice, his tone laced with the quiet authority of an older mentor. "Dustin, ease up. It's Christmas time. She's an old lady. Just run the plate and let her go." Reed's suggestion was born from years of experience, knowing that an unnecessary stop on a senior citizen, especially during the holiday season, rarely ended well for the department. He glanced at Justice Vance, whose composed silence seemed to speak volumes about the injustice of the situation. Reed saw a woman who clearly knew her rights, which only amplified his concern about Hayes's aggressive stance. He tried one more time to de-escalate, reminding Hayes that there were actual crime reports pending, not just vague suspicions of slow driving. Hayes dismissed the advice with a quick, arrogant shake of his head, his focus entirely on asserting his dominance. He refused to admit that his initial instinct might have failed him. He was too deeply invested in the narrative he had already built. "It's just an old lady being difficult, Reed. They always try to pull the sympathy card." This casual dismissal revealed Hayes's entrenched bias, the belief that any sign of non-compliance from a person of color was a calculated strategy to evade justice, rather than a principled stand on civil rights. Reed sighed, recognizing the futility of arguing with Hayes when he was already running on adrenaline and pride. He simply stepped back, choosing to monitor the situation from a distance, hoping his mere presence would prevent Hayes from making a truly career-ending mistake. Meanwhile, Hayes, feeling validated by the arrival of backup, even if that backup was quietly disapproving, returned to Justice Vance's window, his aggression renewed. He felt the need to prove his initial suspicion was correct, not just to Reed, but to himself. Hayes looked past Vance and caught sight of a young woman walking down the sidewalk, her backpack heavy with books. This was Sarah Chen, a sharp Georgetown law student heading to an early study session, and she instantly recognized the dangerous imbalance of power unfolding. Hayes, noticing her lingering gaze, immediately ordered Vance to step out of the vehicle. "Ma'am, for officer safety, you need to step out of the car now." Vance complied slowly, deliberately, her movements emphasizing the forced compliance rather than any genuine threat. The sheer absurdity of the situation, a heavily armed young officer feeling threatened by a composed elderly woman in a cozy sweater, was not lost on Sarah Chen, who paused behind a massive oak tree, her fingers already hovering near her phone camera, preparing to document the injustice. Hayes, entirely focused on gaining physical control, missed the subtle signs of a bystander preparing to turn his routine traffic stop into a national incident. He did not notice Sarah's slight shift in posture or the glint of the camera lens, fully consumed by the need to enforce his personal version of order. His mind was already moving to the next phase, physical command. Hayes felt the need to inspect Vance's personal belongings, convinced she was concealing something, likely the money from a crime she had just committed. "Ma'am, I need to see your ID again. All of it," Hayes demanded, his eyes darting toward the small leather coin purse Vance held firmly in her hand. Vance complied, reaching into the purse with slow, deliberate movements. She knew this was the exact moment of the power play. She first produced her valid driver's license, the familiar plastic card Hayes had already seen and dismissed. Then she retrieved the second card, the dark official federal ID. This card, framed by a thin, unmistakable brass seal, was the key. It bore the embossed words, Supreme Court of the United States, and her official title. Vance held both cards for a brief critical second, giving Hayes every chance to apply wisdom over his arrogance. Yet he failed. Hayes, anticipating a fake ID or perhaps a card for a minor local government office, grabbed the driver's license, ignoring the solemn weight of the federal document. He saw the official card's dark color and the metal seal, but his mind instantly categorized it as a prop part of the sympathy card attempt he had mentioned to Officer Reed. He tucked the license into his pocket and pushed the official ID card back toward her. Keep your little props, ma'am. I just needed the valid state ID. Hayes sneered, clearly dismissing the highest judicial authority in the nation as a cheap attempt at deception. Vance, still unwavering, spoke with the calm precision of someone who had taught constitutional law for decades. Officer, you should check all my identification before proceeding. That badge carries authority. Hayes didn't miss a beat, his arrogance swelling. He tapped the badge on his own chest, right over his heart, and spat back. This badge carries all the authority I need, ma'am. Yours is clearly an unnecessary accessory. Hayes had now doubled down on his initial mistake, not only ignoring but actively insulting the federal badge. His next move was purely physical dominance. He ordered Vance to turn around for a search, pat down. Vance followed the instruction, her movements fluid and unhurried, demonstrating compliance without surrender. As Hayes began the search, his hands moved roughly over the burgundy knit sweater. It was in this moment, as he roughly pulled at the collar, that the subtle metallic gleam was revealed. Vance's official Supreme Court badge, usually pinned discreetly inside her blazer, was momentarily exposed in a tiny sliver beneath the wool. Hayes saw the glint, the distinct shape, and the official nature of the hardware. For a split second he hesitated, realizing this was no cheap novelty. But his pride, fueled by his previous confident calls to dispatch and his dismissive comments to Reed, was too deeply invested in proving his suspicion correct. He quickly shoved the wool collar back into place, effectively ignoring the critical piece of evidence. He refused to admit that the old lady being difficult might hold a position that commanded more authority than his entire precinct. Hayes completed the rough pat-down, finding nothing more than a handkerchief and a tissue. He was completely blind to the truth because he refused to look beyond the color of her skin and the outdated model of her car. Officer Dustin Hayes had run out of excuses. The search was over, no contraband, no weapons, no reason. But the emptiness of that realization clawed at his pride. He couldn't simply walk away and admit error. His authority, already teetering, demanded validation. So he did what too many officers before him had done when faced with the void. He invented one. "Ma'am, you're obstructing a lawful investigation," he declared, stepping back from the open car door. The words were hollow, improvised, but they carried the deadly weight of a badge misused. Hayes's hand drifted toward his belt, unfastening the handcuffs in a smooth, practiced motion. The metallic click sounded small, almost insignificant, yet it marked the irreversible crossing of a line from suspicion to unlawful detention, from error to abuse. Justice Eleanor Vance stood motionless beside the Mercedes, her posture unflinching. Her calmness wasn't resignation, it was understanding. She knew the machinery of ego and power well enough to see it consuming itself. Her hands rested loosely at her sides, fingers relaxed, eyes steady. In that quiet composure, she embodied both tragedy and authority, the living embodiment of law, about to be bound by its own distortion. Across the street, Sarah Chen, a third-year Georgetown law student, froze in disbelief. She had recognized the woman immediately, not as a stranger, but as her mentor, Justice Vance, the very scholar whose lectures had ignited her passion for constitutional law. Sarah had spent semesters analyzing Vance's decisions on civil rights, citing them in papers, quoting her lines in class discussions. And now on this cold Virginia curb, she was watching the author of those opinions being handcuffed like a common suspect. Her first instinct was denial. Then training took over. Sarah pulled out her phone, hands trembling but resolute. She stopped trying to film discreetly. Stepping out from behind the oak tree, she held her phone high, framing both figures, the officer and the justice, in one shot. The timestamp blinked in the corner. Every word, every movement was now evidence. Sarah remembered Vance's own words from a lecture on moral duty. "If you witness injustice, you inherit responsibility. Silence is complicity." Her pulse pounded as she hit record. The screen showed Hayes's hand closing around the steel cuffs. Then Vance's composed profile, unmoved, unreadable. The metallic snap echoed like a verdict. It was the sound of law turned against itself. From his cruiser across the street, Officer Reed saw it all. His gut twisted. He turned his eyes away, unable to stop what was unfolding. He knew the line had been crossed, and the fallout would be unstoppable. Back on the curb, Hayes's voice hardened as he fastened the second cuff. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood of the car, ma'am. Now." His tone was final, commanding, conclusive. Yet beneath it lingered something fragile, the faint tremor of doubt. Sarah zoomed in, ensuring the red light in the corner of her screen kept blinking. Within seconds, the video would go live to her social feed, shared, reposted, immortalized. The nation wouldn't just hear about the event, it would see it. As the first cuff locked around Justice Eleanor Vance's wrist, history turned on the sound of steel and the courage of one witness's finger. "You are about to make the biggest mistake of your life, officer, and it won't be mine." Justice Vance's voice, low and resonant, was the final measured warning before the inevitable breach of protocol. She spoke not out of malice or fear, but with the weary certainty of a prophet witnessing their own prophecy unfold. Hayes, however, was deafened by his own surging ego. He interpreted her calm demeanor, her refusal to be intimidated, as the ultimate act of disrespect, a clear indication that she believed she was above the law. He stepped closer, his face a mask of rigid determination, mistaking his own professional failure for her criminal intent. "I'm doing my job, ma'am, and you're done talking," Hayes snarled, the words designed to shut down any further legal argument. He grabbed her left wrist, his grip unnecessarily firm, and twisted her arm behind her back. The force, though not intended to cause injury, lacked the minimal restraint required when detaining an elderly citizen. His focus was singular: to impose his authority in silence, her legal questioning. The ensuing act was brutal in its carelessness. As Hayes snapped the cold steel cuff around Vance's left wrist, the sharp metal edge scraped against the delicate skin of her inner wrist, right where a minor abrasion had occurred during the earlier pat-down. The initial force of the cuff closing was enough. Vance felt a sharp, brief sting, a physical punctuation mark to the injustice. The subtle but unmistakable sensation of pain brought a moment of profound clarity. This was no longer just a legal disagreement. This was a physical crossing of the line, a wound inflicted by the very system she had spent her life upholding. Hayes, consumed by the satisfaction of finally establishing dominance, was initially oblivious. He moved quickly to secure the right wrist, his breath heavy. Vance did not struggle or cry out. She simply endured the mechanical click of the second cuff locking into place, sealing her fate not as a criminal, but as a symbolic captive of unchecked prejudice. The scene of the cuffed Supreme Court justice, a symbol of ultimate justice standing against the backdrop of quaint, wealthy homes adorned with festive Christmas wreaths, was jarring. Vance, though physically restrained, projected an immense, unyielding mental force. She tilted her head, her eyes fixed on the distant Washington Monument, a monument to American ideals, as if seeking an answer to the fundamental question of governance. Officer Hayes, finally stepping back to admire his work, noticed the small dark stains spreading against the pale burgundy wool of Vance's sweater cuff. A single drop of blood had surfaced from the scratch, quickly wicking into the fabric. The sight of the blood, small as it was, instantly pierced his bubble of arrogance. It wasn't the badge that shocked him yet, but the sudden, visceral reality of the injury. For a fleeting second, the image of the esteemed justice in chains and bleeding caused Hayes's confidence to waver, replaced by a surge of panic, a realization that he had escalated far beyond an acceptable traffic stop, infringing not just on legal rights, but on fundamental human dignity. Hayes quickly tried to suppress the brief, unwelcome panic caused by the sight of blood. He immediately reverted to his default professional defense mechanism: rigid procedure and loud, definitive pronouncements. He shoved the faint memory of the blood aside and tightened his stance, puffing out his chest to Officer Reed, who was watching silently from a few feet away. "You're under arrest for suspicion of impersonating a federal official and obstructing a police investigation, ma'am," Hayes declared, his voice regaining its harsh authority. The charges were ludicrous, entirely based on his rejection of the official ID card she had attempted to show him. He felt compelled to justify the extreme use of force, handcuffs to his backup officer, revealing the depth of his prejudice in a low, conspiratorial whisper meant only for Reed. "This is what they do, Reed. They try to play the big shot when they know they're caught. They want to turn it into a scene. The use of the generic they was a subtle but clear indictment of Vance's identity, her race, age, and perceived socioeconomic status packaging all his biases into a neat, cynical observation. Reed simply shook his head slightly, a gesture of silent disagreement that Hayes chose to ignore. This display of flagrant injustice finally pushed beyond the acceptable boundaries of the immediate witnesses. Mrs. Peterson, an elderly resident in her 70s who was out walking her small poodle, had stopped frozen across the street. She was a meticulous follower of the news, especially the decisions coming out of Washington, D.C., and she instantly recognized the dignified silver-haired woman in handcuffs. The shock of seeing her legal icon treated this way was immense. Mrs. Peterson dropped her dog's leash in astonishment and let out a strangled cry that cut through the early morning quiet. "That's Justice Vance. She's on the news all the time. Are you crazy, officer?" The name, spoken aloud by a respected community member, hit Hayes harder than a physical blow. Other neighbors, alerted by the commotion and the flashing lights, began to emerge onto their porches, pulling their bathrobes tight against the cold. The sight of the elderly black woman in handcuffs, now named by a reliable local source, created a wave of immediate, collective outrage. Simultaneously, the digital world exploded. Sarah Chen, the law student, watched the local community outrage begin to form a physical crowd. With a mix of fear and righteous conviction, she confirmed the arrest, attached the clear video footage she had just captured of Hayes applying the cuffs, and published the incident across all her social media channels. The caption was simple and damning. "Alexandria PD officer arrests Supreme Court Justice Vance for driving while black." The combination of the shouted recognition and the immediate global dissemination of the video created the true climax, the point where Hayes' personal mistake became a monumental public disaster. Hayes stood paralyzed, realizing his local misdemeanor was suddenly a national headline, and the small crowd forming around him was growing rapidly, their faces a mixture of confusion and righteous anger. The shouting of Justice Vance and the rising tide of local outrage finally broke Officer Hayes' professional composure. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen color that betrayed his inner turmoil. The sound of the dog barking and the neighbors murmuring about the Supreme Court title seemed to physically press against him, suffocating the last remnants of his arrogant pride. He slowly turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the angry crowd, then down to the woman he had just shackled like a common criminal. He finally let his eyes linger on the burgundy wool of her sweater, now clearly visible to him again. The small, dark stain of blood on her cuff was now an accusation, not just a physical reality. The full weight of the situation, the title, the name, the blood, and the surrounding crowd slammed into him. He fumbled in his pocket for the wallet and the official ID he had so arrogantly dismissed moments earlier. His hand shook so violently that he nearly dropped the laminated card as he finally pulled it out. He held it up to the light, and for the first time, he actually read the words embossed beneath the seal. Supreme Court Justice. His mind flashed back to the legal lectures and the constant training sessions that warned against exactly this kind of mistake, the unwarranted use of force against a federal official. He knew in that instant that his 7 years of confidence, his entire career, and perhaps his freedom were hanging by a thread. The gravity of detaining a member of the highest court in the land, based purely on discriminatory instincts, was a catastrophe. Hayes desperately needed validation, a supervisor, anyone to take control of the rapidly deteriorating situation. His fingers, numb and clumsy, finally managed to hit the correct channel on his radio, his professional veneer shattering completely. His voice, once full of aggressive authority, was now a pathetic croak, thick with panic and disbelief. He managed to choke out the required protocol. "Dispatch, confirm the license holder of vehicle, and I need a supervisor on the scene. Now." The urgency in his tone was immediate and desperate, a far cry from the casual report he had given minutes earlier. The camera, held steadily by the law student, shifted from the horrified faces of the neighbors to the woman at the center of the storm. Justice Vance stood silently by the patrol car, her head held high, the handcuffs glinting cold and cruel against her wrists. The frame lingered on the small, dark stain of blood on her winter sweater, a stark, visual testament to the arrogance of unchecked power. The camera then swung abruptly, focusing tightly on Officer Hayes's face. His eyes were wide and vacant, the color drained, completely consumed by the profound realization of the enormous, terrifying mistake he had just made. Officer Hayes's earpiece crackled to life, but this time the dispatcher's voice wasn't clipped or procedural. It trembled with horror. "That's Supreme Court Justice Eleanor Vance, Officer Hayes. You need to uncuff her immediately and await a supervisor." The words didn't sound like an order, they sounded like a desperate plea. Every syllable hammered into Hayes's skull, each one stripping away another layer of his certainty. His breath hitched. The confidence that had carried him through countless stops evaporated in an instant. He lunged for his keyring, fumbling clumsily with trembling hands that no longer obeyed him. The cuffs clinked, the metal biting deeper into Justice Vance's wrist as he struggled to unlock them. The brief delay made the wound bloom red again, a thin trickle of blood against her pale skin. When the latch finally gave way, the sound of the cuffs hitting the pavement was sharp and final. It didn't sound like release. It sounded like judgment. Justice Eleanor Vance rubbed her wrist slowly, not in anger, but in a gesture of quiet, deliberate composure. Her eyes met Hayes's, steady and unreadable in evaluation, not a confrontation. Within minutes, Lieutenant Davis, Hayes's supervisor, arrived, his expression a mix of dread and disbelief. He didn't spare Hayes a single glance. His focus was entirely on the woman before him, the most powerful jurist in the country. "Justice Vance, I can't begin to express," he stammered, but his apology dissolved into nervous fragments. The small crowd that had gathered, neighbors, joggers, passers-by, had already pieced together what had happened. Phones were raised. Voices rose with them. Someone shouted for Hayes's badge. Another demanded his gun. Justice Vance lifted one hand just slightly, and the chaos stopped. Her calm authority carried more power than any shouted command. "Lieutenant," she said evenly, "ensure every officer here identifies themselves. I expect a full incident report. Every deviation from protocol will be documented." There was no venom in her tone, only precision. It was not vengeance she sought, it was record. When Davis offered to escort her home or to the station in an official vehicle, Vance declined with a quiet wave of her hand. She adjusted the sleeve of her burgundy sweater, concealing the faint red mark on her wrist. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I require no further assistance from the Alexandria Police Department today. I'll arrange my own transportation." She took out her phone, ignoring Hayes entirely, and requested an Uber. The gesture was small, but its meaning was enormous, a Supreme Court justice refusing the comfort of institutional courtesy, choosing instead the independence of an ordinary citizen. As she stood on the curb, waiting for her ride beside two motionless patrol cars, the image burned itself into every recording device in sight. The nation would soon see it. An elderly black justice, dignified and unbent, standing alone beneath a winter sky, her wrist marked by a careless act of authority. And that image, quiet, undeniable, viral, would do what no lecture, no ruling, no law could: expose the truth. Justice Vance's deliberate refusal to use the police vehicle sealed the narrative that was already erupting across the globe. Sarah Chen, the quick-thinking law student, had successfully posted the full video footage of Hayes's escalating confrontation and the moment the handcuffs were applied. The caption, "Supreme Court Justice Cuffed for Being Black in Rich Neighborhood," acted like digital dynamite. The clip, clear and horrifying, was immediately picked up by cable news networks and was trending across every major social media platform within the hour. The fact that the victim was not an anonymous citizen, but Justice Eleanor Vance, a name synonymous with constitutional law and integrity, turned the localized incident into a national reckoning. The atmosphere inside the Alexandria DPD Command Center was pure chaos. Lieutenant Davis, having raced back, found his superiors in a state of outright panic. The command center, usually a hub of organized activity, was now a scene of frantic phone calls and desperate attempts to contain the narrative. The department's PR team quickly confirmed Vance's identity, inadvertently fueling the fire by validating the video's authenticity. The media was already dissecting Hayes's history, and the department discovered, to its horror, that Hayes's file contained several previously dismissed complaints, a pattern of unwarranted stops against minority drivers. Hayes's earlier arrogance about his instincts was now being systematically exposed by his own record. The crisis deepened when major news outlets highlighted the fact that Justice Vance was the lead author of a major Supreme Court opinion that limited a police officer's right to initiate unwarranted traffic stops, based on vague suspicion, the very type of stop Hayes had initiated. The irony was devastating. The officer had arrested the architect of the very law he was breaking. The story was no longer about a bad cop. It was about a systemic failure that had brazenly struck at the heart of the American justice system. Hayes was brought in for interrogation, his confidence completely gone, replaced by a terrified, hollow silence. He watched the news reports on a small monitor in the interview room, his face reflecting the devastating realization that he hadn't just made a mistake, he had committed professional suicide in front of the world. Hayes sat rigid in the interrogation room, the volume of the small monitor muted, yet the images were screaming at him. The national media had juxtaposed images of Justice Vance, one in her dignified black judicial robe, the next showing her elderly cuffed hands against the cruiser. They had then focused the entire narrative onto a quote from one of her old judicial training lectures. "The law is blind, but its enforcers must not be." The quote served as a brutal, implicit judgment of Hayes's actions. The public backlash was immense and unified, reaching into the highest echelons of federal government. Hayes's entire existence, built upon a fragile foundation of perceived authority and racial bias, was collapsing around him in a cascade of media reports and departmental panic. He had been found wanting, judged not by his peers but by the very standard of legal consciousness he had failed to uphold. Later that evening, long after the TV crews had set up camp outside the precinct and the national spotlight had settled on the small city of Alexandria, Vance sat alone in her quiet, book-lined study. She carefully cleaned the tiny wound on her wrist, the sight of the blood a clear, physical reminder of the boundary Hayes had crossed. She was not fueled by anger or a desire for retribution. Her mind, rather, was already in the court of systemic reform. The personal affront was secondary to the institutional failure. She knew that firing Hayes was the easy way out, but it wouldn't change the underlying rot. The real work was in the foundation. She picked up the phone, the official number for the Federal Judicial Ethics Council on the display, and dialed a trusted colleague. Her voice, devoid of emotion, was focused entirely on the future. The phone rang twice before her colleague answered. Vance spoke with the measured calm of a judge delivering a final order, the quiet resonance of her voice a terrifying contrast to the day's chaos. "Camerly Agen, vet mau kotran kote, Vance." Her voice, calm and determined, resonated. "It's time, John. We need to look at the training manuals again. All of them." Vance had taught generations of law students that the most effective leaders seek to fix broken structures, not merely punish flawed individuals. This principle formed the bedrock of her strategy following the arrest. The national conversation was fixated on Officer Hayes's punishment, but Vance's focus was already years ahead. The very next day, the media ran her famous quote, "If we only fix the incident, the system will repeat the pattern. We must fix the pattern." This statement served as the intellectual hook for the department's internal affairs investigation and the subsequent public discourse. It shifted the debate away from personal retribution toward systemic accountability, a far more challenging and necessary conversation. When the internal affairs report landed on the desk of the DPD chief, it painted a damning picture not just of Hayes, but of the department's training protocols. The report cited numerous instances of implicit bias in Hayes's past stops, all dismissed under the vague defense of officer instinct. Vance understood that Hayes's arrogance was simply a byproduct of a system that validated his prejudices. He wasn't malicious. He was badly trained and conditioned. Her colleague John from the Judicial Ethics Council confirmed that her proposal to revise police training manuals was already circulating in D.C., a monumental undertaking that required the moral leverage the incident had provided. The crucial event came during Hayes's mandatory internal affairs interrogation. He was cornered, defeated, and expected to defend his actions. But Justice Vance requested an unusual arrangement. She would submit her testimony via a formal question, delivered through the panel, directly to Hayes. The question was designed not to accuse, but to force self-reflection. It wasn't about the law he broke. It was about the fundamental failure of his perception. Her action underlined the central tenet of her judicial career, the importance of legal awareness over automatic obedience to procedure. She knew that the true moment of justice would arrive when Hayes could no longer deflect the mirror she held up to his face. She was preparing to offer him a chance at professional redemption, a far heavier burden than mere termination. The internal affairs hearing was less a trial and more a tense, clinical examination of the systemic rot within the department. Justice Vance's presence via live video feed from her Supreme Court chambers loomed large over the proceedings, focusing the room not on the handcuffs, but on the conscience. Officer Hayes, seated rigidly before the panel, maintained a weak defense rooted in procedural training, but his arrogance was gone, replaced by a nervous, palpable dread. The moment arrived for Vance's submitted question to be read aloud. The Internal Affairs Director cleared his throat, his voice suddenly sounding small in the sterile conference room. Officer Hayes, Justice Vance would like to know this. What did you see in her that made her seem more dangerous to you than the badge she carried? The question landed with the force of a gavel. It wasn't about a missed code or a failed procedure. It was a profound ethical interrogation of his soul. Hayes could not answer. His silence stretched, an agonizing and eloquent admission of his ingrained bias. He had categorized her by race and attire, a perceived threat, rather than recognizing the authority symbolized by the badge she held. He saw a lurker, not a jurist. His internal logic, the very instincts he had boasted about, shattered under the weight of her simple, undeniable truth. Vance watched his defeated silence on the screen, her expression unwavering. She had her answer. The goal was not to crush him, but to force this recognition. She did not seek to destroy the man. She sought to correct the systemic error that had created him. It was then that Vance delivered her ultimate act of grace, shocking the hearing panel, the DPD chief, and Hayes himself. When the panel turned to Vance for her recommended disciplinary action, they expected termination, a lawsuit, or a public condemnation. Instead, Vance calmly delivered her verdict on the system's failure. I do not recommend Officer Hayes' termination. A gasp ran through the room. She explained that firing him would be the easy route, merely replacing one prejudiced mind with another in the next hiring cycle. If we fire him, we simply replace one prejudiced mindset with another. We must fix the mind, not just the roster, she stated, her voice resonating with conviction. She proposed that Hayes be subjected to mandatory, intensive implicit bias retraining and mentorship while on unpaid suspension, focusing on civil rights history and the very legal precedents he had violated. Her aim was a professional salvation, not ruin. The DPD chief, facing immense public pressure, quickly approved Vance's recommendation, a 6-month unpaid suspension for Officer Hayes, coupled with mandatory advanced retraining focused on the ethics of police stops and civil rights law. It was a painful, yet ultimately redemptive sentence. Hayes stood to receive the news, his head bowed. When he finally looked up, his eyes met Vance's on the screen. The arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by a profound sense of humiliation mixed with something akin to a shocked, silent gratitude. He realized she had used her immense power not to destroy him, but to save him from himself and from a system that would have otherwise consumed him. The positive ripple effects of Vance's actions were immediate and personal. A few days later, Sarah Chen, the law student, received an unexpected official letter, a formal offer to interview for a prestigious clerkship at Justice Vance's chambers, effectively recognizing her moral courage as a crucial element of justice. Sarah's small, brave act of recording the truth had paid forward into a life-changing opportunity. Meanwhile, Officer Hayes was left alone in his apartment, stripped of his badge, uniform, and salary. His pride was shattered, but he was left with a path forward. On his kitchen counter lay a small package, A gift from the Judicial Ethics Council, a copy of A History of Civil Rights Law, with a personal note from Vance's clerk. Hayes picked up the thick book, his eyes lingering on the title. The man who refused to read a badge was now being forced to read history. The shame was immense, but for the first time in his career, he felt a genuine, terrifying obligation, not to his uniform, but to a higher moral standard. He opened the book and began to read, the first page revealing the name of the author of the pivotal 1968 ruling on police discretion, a law he had so carelessly violated. Hayes sat alone, the silence in his apartment heavy with the weight of his actions. He was no longer the arrogant officer, but a student of history, trying to understand the depth of his blindness. He looked at his service handgun, then at the open book, choosing the path of painful learning over easy self-pity. He opened the book and began to read, his eyes fixed on the bold title of the first chapter, Justice Must Be Seen. A year had passed. Winter had returned to Alexandria, Virginia, carrying with it the crisp scent of pine and the faint sweetness of holiday fires. Christmas lights blinked softly against the early dusk, a quiet reminder that time, though relentless, could heal what it once shattered. Officer Dustin Hayes, now 30, eased his patrol car along a quiet stretch of the city's South District, a far cry from the affluent streets where his arrogance had once cost him everything. The uniform still fit, but the man inside it was not the same. 6 months of unpaid suspension and an unrelenting re-education had stripped him of certainty and replaced it with something deeper, perspective. He had been made to study history, civil rights law, and ethics page by page, case by case, guided, ironically, by a book Justice Eleanor Vance herself had ensured was sent to him through official channels. It was her way of teaching without speaking. Somewhere within its pages, a single line had branded itself into his conscience. The law is a tool, but awareness is the craftsman. He repeated it often, a quiet mantra murmured beneath his breath on long patrols. Hayes had finally understood. The law in untrained hands could wound as easily as it could protect. A blind craftsman breaks what he builds. The transformation didn't end with him. The Alexandria Police Department had been forced into a mirror it could no longer look away from. Public outrage, federal review, and Vance's quiet but firm recommendations had reshaped the department's very bones. Training manuals were rewritten. Implicit bias and de-escalation courses became mandatory. The mantra, perception over force, replaced command and control. Lieutenant Davis, once haunted by the memory of that winter morning, now led the reform unit. His rise in rank wasn't reward, it was responsibility. He often cited Hayes's case as the necessary rupture that forced the rebuild. For what had once been a scandal was now institutional scripture, a daily reminder that accountability had to live at the heart of authority. And Justice Eleanor Vance, true to her word, had turned her ordeal into legacy. She never gave interviews. She never revisited the scene. Instead, she sent her Supreme Court badge, the one marked by the faint, nearly invisible scratch left by the handcuffs, to the National Museum of Law. The plaque beneath it read simply, "Authority is fragile. Awareness is its only safeguard." No mention of names, no bitterness, just truth. The badge, gleaming under museum lights, became both artifact and warning. Visitors stopped to stare, unaware that the woman who once wore it still lived quietly in Alexandria, walking her dog through the same streets where justice had once been tested. For Hayes, each patrol through those winter streets was an act of penance and sight. What had once been a world of suspicion in categories now appeared layered, human, and painfully alive. He had lost his certainty, but gained something far rarer, the gift of seeing clearly. One clear afternoon, Justice Vance and Sarah Chen, who was now working as a clerk in Vance's chambers, a young mind mentored directly by the wisdom she once only read, in case law, were walking down the familiar old street in Alexandria. The houses were again draped in twinkling Christmas lights, a symbol of the enduring community spirit that had been so sharply contrasted by the cold steel of the handcuffs a year prior. They were picking up last-minute holiday gifts, enjoying the crisp winter air. Vance was once again wearing a humble, heavy winter coat, a quiet symbol of her consistent personal style, refusing to let the incident dictate her identity or her freedom of movement. She moved with the same deliberate pace, radiating the quiet confidence of a woman whose dignity had been tested and proven indestructible. As they approached the very corner where the patrol cars had once blocked traffic, Sarah instinctively reached for Vance's arm, a subtle, protective gesture born from witnessing the trauma firsthand. Vance gently squeezed Sarah's hand, acknowledging the shared memory but reassuring her of the present safety. It was at that very intersection that a familiar patrol car approached. The vehicle moved slowly, professionally, its lights dark, its speed respectful of the residential area. Behind the wheel was Officer Dustin Hayes. The atmosphere of the scene instantly shifted, becoming tense. Not with fear, but with profound recognition. Hayes immediately saw Justice Vance. There was no hesitation in his movement, no trace of the frantic panic that had paralyzed him a year ago. Hayes, now armed with awareness rather than just authority, instantly pulled his cruiser to a controlled, professional stop, not aggressively blocking traffic, but simply pausing his patrol. He performed the mandatory protocol check in his head, finding no violation, no suspicious movement, and certainly no reason to initiate contact. Yet he knew he couldn't simply drive by the woman who had redefined his career and his moral compass. He saw her not as a suspicious person, but as Justice Vance, the embodiment of the principles he now swore to uphold. The moment was suspended, a quiet reckoning 1 year in the making. Hayes's training taught him to drive on, but his new consciousness compelled him to acknowledge the debt. Hayes's training taught him professional distance, but his personal transformation demanded recognition. He quietly put the car in park, unbuckled his seatbelt, and slowly stepped out of the cruiser. The act itself was a monumental gesture, a voluntary break in routine, a sign of respect that required moral courage. He walked toward the curb where Vance and Sarah stood, his posture straight, his hands visibly clear of his weapon, resting loosely at his sides. He stopped 3 feet from Vance, his gaze respectful and steady, devoid of the aggressive scrutiny that had marked their first encounter. He did not offer an apology. He knew words were inadequate for the humiliation he had caused. He did not seek forgiveness. He knew that was a reward he had to earn over a lifetime. Instead, Hayes simply stood at attention, his eyes meeting the calm, intelligent gaze of the woman he had once dared to shackle. He performed a deep, silent, respectful nod, a gesture of profound deference, recognition, and acknowledgement of her identity and the error of his ways. It was an admission of guilt, an acceptance of responsibility, and a quiet pledge of reformed conduct, all communicated without a single word. Vance returned his gaze. She did not nod back or offer a gesture of forgiveness, choosing instead to acknowledge his silent apology with a look of pure understanding. The moment was complete, a quiet, powerful resolution that transcended mere legal formalities. Hayes returned to his cruiser, got in, and continued his patrol, his work now imbued with deeper meaning. Vance watched him drive off, then turned back to Sarah Chen, whose eyes were wide with wonder and emotion at the silent scene they had just witnessed. Vance offered a slight, knowing smile, the first true, personal smile of the entire narrative, recognizing that the greatest victory had just occurred. She squeezed Sarah's hand, confirming the profound moral lesson that had just been quietly delivered and received. Justice Vance continued walking down the street, surrounded by the warmth of the holiday lights, her head held high, the wound on her wrist now just a distant memory. She looked down at Sarah Chen and spoke softly, her voice carrying the quiet wisdom of a lifetime on the bench. That, my dear, is how you truly win a case. And so, the quiet, lasting lesson of that chilly Christmas season wasn't found in a courtroom verdict or a loud headline, but in the silent space between 2 steps on a familiar street. It reminds us that true authority resides not in the badge you wear, but in the wisdom you carry, and that respect is a debt owed to every human being, regardless of the coat they have on. Sometimes the most profound victories aren't won by fighting back, but by holding steady so that the blinded can finally be taught how to see.